This happened about 3 years ago when my wife and I first moved into our dream home. It was a beautiful little house in a quiet neighborhood. It was the perfect place for us newlyweds to start our life together. As we were moving in, our neighbor to the left of us watched us from his window. My wife and I waved, but he didn't wave back or come out to speak to us. A few days later, I saw him when I stepped outside on my patio to have a drink of coffee. This is when he finally came over and introduced himself. His name was Ed, and he was your stereotypical eccentric old man. And as the days went by, I noticed that he had this weird vibe about him, like he was always watching, always lurking just out of sight. And let me tell you, he had a knack for showing up at the most unexpected times. It started innocently enough. He'd pop by with a plate of cookies or offer to help with yard work. But as time went on, his visits became more frequent, more intrusive. He'd show up unannounced, just to chat with my wife while I was at work. And sometimes he'd linger for hours, rambling on about who knows what while she politely nodded along, trying to find a way to escape. At first I thought maybe he was just lonely, maybe he didn't have anyone else to talk to. But then things started to get even more creepy. I'd come home to find him standing in our backyard, peering through the windows like he was spying on us. And one night, I woke up to find him standing at the foot of our bed, just staring at us with this blank expression on his face. I tell you, I've never been more freaked out in my life. I mean, who does that? Who just waltzes into someone's house in the middle of the night and watches them sleep? I tried talking to him about it, but he just brushed it off like it was no big deal. Said he was just checking to make sure we were okay. Yeah, right. But the creepiest part? It wasn't just the unexpected visits or the late-night staring sessions. It was the way he seemed to know things about us that he shouldn't. Like one time, he mentioned offhand that my wife's favorite color was blue. Now, I know what you're thinking, that's not so weird, right? But here's the thing. My wife had never mentioned her favorite color to him, not even once. It was like he was watching us, studying us, cataloging every little detail about our lives. And that's when I knew we had to get out of there, before things got even weirder. So, we packed up our things and moved out as fast as we could. We put our house back on the market while we took up at a nearby hotel. Thankfully, it didn't take long for our house to sell, since it was in such a great neighborhood. Hopefully, whoever moves in does not have to deal with Ed and his strange visits like we did. So, there I was, fresh out of college and ready to take on the world. I found this cute little apartment in a quiet neighborhood, perfect for a fresh start. But unfortunately for me, things were about to get seriously creepy. It all started when I met my neighbor, Mr. Prescott. At first, he seemed like a nice enough guy, always offering to help me carry groceries or fix things around the apartment. But there was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. You see, Mr. Prescott had this way of looking at me, like he was sizing me up, trying to figure me out. I mean, it was just weird. I think that he was attracted to me. And then there were the times when I'd catch him standing outside my door, just staring at it like he was waiting for something. The thought crossed my mind more than once that maybe he'd try to overpower me and attack me or something. I tried to brush it off at first, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then, things started to escalate. I'd hear strange noises coming from his apartment when I walked past it late at night, like someone was moving around inside. And sometimes, when I looked out my window, I could see him standing outside looking up to my window, watching me with those cold, dead eyes. I finally had enough, so I started avoiding him as much as possible. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always there, lurking just beyond my sight. Then one night, things took a turn for the worse. I was home alone, just settling in for the night watching some TV in my living room, when I heard a faint scratching at my door. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it happened again, louder this time. My heart pounding in my chest, I tiptoed over to the door and peered through the peephole, only to find Mr. Prescott standing on the other side with a crazed look in his eyes. Then it dawned on me that he was trying to break in. I froze, not knowing what to do. Should I call the police? Scream for help? Before I could make up my mind, Mr. Prescott started banging on the door, his fists pounding against the wood with a fury that scared the living crap out of me. Desperate to escape, I grabbed my cell phone and ran to the back of the apartment and locked myself in the bathroom, praying that he wouldn't find me. But the banging only grew louder, echoing through the tiny space like a death knell. I frantically called 911 and told them what was happening. They said that they would send a squad car out immediately. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the banging stopped. My apartment grew silent, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I waited for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. And then, slowly, cautiously, I crept out of the bathroom and peeked around the corner. Mr. Prescott was gone, vanished into the night like he was never there at all. When the cops arrived, I told them what happened and what apartment Mr. Prescott lived in. The cops went over to his apartment, but he was nowhere in sight. The apartment was actually vacant, with the exception of a cheap futon couch, and the apartment manager had informed them that that apartment was currently not rented to anyone. Mr. Prescott, or whatever his name was, had broken in and was pretending to live there. I moved from that building not too long after that for fear that I'd run into him again. The memory of his crazed expression and those pounding fists still haunt me to this day. This happened a few months back when this guy, let's call him Mr. Smith, moved into the house next to mine. At first I didn't think much of it. I mean, people move in and out all the time, right? But pretty soon, I started to notice some strange things about Mr. Smith. First off, he never seemed to leave his house during the day. I'm talking 0 daylight hours. But that wasn't even the weirdest part. No, what really piqued my curiosity was the fact that every night, like clockwork, Mr. Smith would be out prowling around the neighborhood. Now, I'm not talking about a leisurely stroll. I'm talking about full-on creeping, like he was trying to stay hidden in the shadows. And then, I started noticing things going missing. At first, it was just little stuff. A package here, a piece of mail there. I figured it was just a coincidence, you know? But when it kept happening, I started to get suspicious. I asked my neighbor on the right side of me and a few others across the street if they too had been having packages going missing. Just about every neighbor I asked said that they have. I thought, oh great, we've got ourselves a porch pirate in the neighborhood. I decided to do a little investigating of my own to find out who was behind the thefts. I installed a camera on our front porch in hopes of catching the thief once and for all. One night, I stayed up late, and I watched from my window as Mr. Smith made his rounds. And that's when I saw him. He was going through people's mailboxes, rifling through their letters like he was looking for something specific. But it didn't stop there. Oh no, things got even creepier. I started noticing Mr. Smith digging through people's trash cans, like he was searching for buried treasure or something. It was really bizarre. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. I mean, who goes dumpster diving in the middle of the night? But then, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Mr. Smith wasn't just a weirdo, he was up to something much more menacing. Turns out, Mr. Smith wasn't just stealing people's mail for kicks and giggles. No, he was trying to steal our identities. I couldn't believe it at first. I mean, how could someone be so twisted? But the more I thought about it, the more it all started to make sense. The weird hours, the sneaking around, it was all part of his master plan to rob us blind. The next morning, I told some of my neighbors what I saw and even showed them footage from the camera I had installed. I called the cops and showed them the footage as well. And let me tell you, when they busted down Mr. Smith's door and dragged him away in handcuffs, it was like something out of a movie. Yeah, the guy next door was a full-on identity thief, selling people's personal information on the dark web like it was no big deal. And all this time, he'd been living right under our noses. After that, I think that all of us are a little more careful with what we do with our old trash, just in case there are more creeps out there just like him, lurking in the shadows, waiting to prey on unsuspecting victims. So let me tell you about the time I had the creepiest neighbor ever move in across the hall in my apartment building. It was really spooky, I swear. I was staying at this cozy little apartment building that sat in the heart of the city. It had old creaky floors and dimly lit hallways. It was the kind of place where you knew everyone's business, whether you wanted to or not. Anyway, one day, this new neighbor moves in across the hall from me. Her name was Ms. Henderson, and let me tell you, she was a real piece of work. She was an eccentric older woman with wild, unkempt hair and eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. From the moment she moved in, Ms. Henderson was always trying to get me to come into her apartment. She'd knock on my door at all hours of the day and night, claiming she needed help with this or that. But there was something about her that just didn't sit right with me. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm all for being neighborly and helping out when I can. But there was just something off about Mrs. Henderson, something that made my skin crawl every time she looked at me with those piercing eyes of hers. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just lonely, I thought. Maybe she just needed someone to talk to. But the more she persisted, the more I started to feel like there was something seriously wrong with her. It wasn't just the constant knocking on my door either. It was the way she'd watch me from her window as I came and went, like she was studying my every move. And sometimes, when I'd see her in the hallway, she'd give me this creepy smile that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to avoid her as much as possible, but it seemed like no matter where I went in the building, she was always there, deep in the shadows. It was like she was haunting me, like she was some kind of ghost that couldn't rest until she had me in her clutches. But just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, they did. One night I was woken up by a strange noise coming from Ms. Henderson's apartment. It sounded like someone was whispering, but when I listened closer, I realized it was just her talking to herself. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the whispering only got louder and more frantic. It was like she was having a full-blown conversation with someone who wasn't there. I got so annoyed with all the noise, so I walked over to her apartment and knocked on her door. I wanted to give her a piece of my mind and tell her to keep it down. But when she opened the door, she wasn't alone. Standing behind her was a figure dressed all in black, its face shrouded in darkness. It was like something straight out of a nightmare, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare in horror. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, and Ms. Henderson was standing there looking at me with those same piercing eyes. I didn't stick around to find out what was going on. I turned tail and ran back to my apartment, locking the door behind me and trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me like a thick fog. I never saw Mrs. Henderson again after that night. She disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but whispers and shadows. I moved out too, not long after that when my lease was up. To this day, I still can't figure out if I really saw what I think I saw, or if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Thanks for watching. Don't miss out on more spine-chilling tales. Subscribe now for weekly scares. Hit that red button and join our journey into the unknown.